now I want to invite our first plenary speaker, Josiane Venture. Josiane is the professor of University of Tokyo. She is well known for her works on human-robot interaction. She's particularly focuses on dynamics of humans, robots, and environments. Josiane, are you able to show your
Yes.
screen?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, yes, the floor is yours. Uh, please share your screen.
Yeah, I am. I think you should see me and the screen at the same time. Is that all good with you?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, Harson, for the introduction. I'd like to thank also the organizers for inviting me to this amazing conference. Yesterday, I stayed as long as I could, and it was really a very eye-opening and mind-blowing conference presentations and discussions that were happening. So I was really happy to join. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some of the research that we've been doing in my lab and the most recent work that is a lot of unpublished things, but that we've been working on for a couple of years now. I entitled my presentations Robots and Us, because as Arsen mentioned, I work in human-robot interaction and some of my work. And I am interested in trying to understand what happens when we are introducing robots into ecological environments, and in particular environments where there are humans, but not only. And so in this presentation, I would like to try to shed some lights on the ways in which robots could be integrated into various aspects of our society. And I would like to explore with you the potential for collaborations and synergies between humans and robots, and in particular, to use nonverbal communication to enable a smoother and more synergetic interaction. And of course, there are a number of limitations, and I would like to try to discuss these limitations. And so my presentation is organized into four main parts. The first part will be very brief about understanding expressive movements. The second part will be about generating expressive robot controls. And then I will also very briefly introduce some work that we've been doing on robot design and slow technology, and you'll understand why I want to talk about that. And then finally, I would like to introduce the most recent work that we've been doing with philosophers on the ethology of robots and try to advocate the needs for experiments in the wild. And so in this presentation, I hope that there will, I hope this presentation will be an opportunity for us to start discussions. There was quite a few talks that relates to what I'm going to talk about today, yesterday. And I know that in the afternoon and later this morning, there will be also more things related to that. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So let me start with a very short introduction about understanding expressive movements. And in particular, what I am interested in is nonverbal communication. So you know very much, probably that study, which is a psychological study from 1944, where you have shapes that are moving into a 2D plane. And by just looking at those shapes, you can actually try to infer a story. And then you can also try to infer characters, personalities, and eventually moods or feelings to these shapes. And what was very, very interesting with this very old study is that it really paved the way for understanding apparent behavior and the way that we humans have to basically do storytelling and infer things when there is absolutely nothing to infer, maybe. And so that makes me make the connection with communication, because the idea of like doing some storytelling, the idea about like trying to make a story out of nothing about just shapes that are moving is really one of the features, I would say, of ourselves and our intelligence. And how that is communicating those stories and those expressions. And so communication, as per definition, is the activity or process that expresses ideas or feeling or provide information. Well, in the definition, they say to people, but it could be to anything else. You could communicate with your dog, you could communicate maybe with your plant, and you can communicate with the environment in general. So I would like to say that it does not limit to people, actually. And there has been a number of studies about 50 years ago on communication, and they have shown that nonverbal communication represents basically 2/3 of the communication, and that verbal communication is in the end not so important. And so today in my presentation, I really want to focus on nonverbal communication, even though sometimes, it's very few times, our robot might be speaking. More than often they don't speak. They only use nonverbal communication. And so to try to understand nonverbal communication in humans, but not only, we based our research on a model that was proposed 46 years ago by Russell and Mehrabian. And this is the pleasure arousal dominance model. So those that are familiar with emotion models and expressions might be familiar with this model. It's a three-dimensional model, which is very nice for us as scientists, because three independent dimensions means that we can have a very nice representation. It means that we're basically able to work in a three-dimensional space, things that we're manipulating all the time. And so that's very, very good for us. And so mathematically speaking, then we can formulate it into most of our explanations. And in order to understand what pleasure, arousal, and dominance is, a couple of years after Russell and Mehrabian proposed this model, they actually also proposed the self-assessment mannequin, which was originally designed for people to assess themselves. What are the mood or the situation in which they are at the moment. And so the self-assessment mannequin is using these like three dimensions, and you have the pleasure, you have the arousal, and you have the domination. And in the dominance here. And so by looking at those images, it's very easy for one to try to assess themselves, but you can also use that to assess something or situation that you're actually looking at. And so using the PAD model and the self-assessment mannequin, we have developed systems. I think this might be slightly cut. Let me just try to get this back. Because I think it might be, no, it's fine. Okay, sorry. What we were doing is we're equipping our robots with a number of different types of sensors, whether this is microphones, cameras, touch sensor, range sensors, eventually force sensors, and also environmental sensors. For instance, we can measure the temperature, we can measure the humidity of the air, which is very much relevant in Japan. We can also measure through the audio sensors, but also we can measure the noise, we can measure the brightness of an environment. And so we can extract from all of those sensors using some very basic machine learning techniques or more sophisticated deep learning techniques. We extract a pleasure arousal model of the human. We extract also a pleasure arousal model of the environment. And then also using the robot sensor information, for instance, how close the robot is moving to its joint limits, how close or far the robot is moving to its torque limits, we can extract also a robot pleasure arousal dominance representation. And based on all of this information, we can decide what will be the next robot action. And so by creating this, we were able to propose a novel system architecture where, for instance, our robot here is using its head cameras to read the person face and the person posture, as well as the person movements. It's using its hands cameras to recognize objects. And then there is a proximity sensor that you don't see here that is hidden behind around someplace here. And then there is also the sensor, the camera that is basically looking at the shape of the hand so that the robot can actually deliver the objects in the end, as it was done just before, or also detect where the person is pointing at. And so try to pick the object that the person made. And that's all using pleasure arousal dominance models. Well, that's a good start. But right now we're using only the expressive representation of the human, but we're not yet giving expressivity per se to the robot. So for instance, when our robot is sensing information in the environment that could be useful to provide to the human, or when our robot is reaching joint limits or torque limits, the robot might want to be able to communicate this information to the human. And so we want to be able to do it, but we don't want the robot to talk. And we don't want the robot also to have necessarily extra lights and extra information, because that's going to be more channels for the human to read and to try to understand. But that also could be very confusing. While if we have a good way to be expressive, then that could be helpful for the human, while at the same time, it doesn't add on the cognitive load of the human to process this information. So we proposed a number of different methods to do expressive control and to generate expressive movements for our robots. The oldest methods that we proposed was the null space control that was taking advantage of the robot kinematic redundancy. And by doing that, we are able to generate robot movements that are actually basically just a lower priority of the task, where the expressivity is here kicking in. So we have a task that we want to achieve, and that task is here our x dot, which is the Cartesian task realization. So here in this example, the robot is just waving its hand. And then by using the null space decomposition and the null space control with inverse kinematics, we are able to add to that task a number of degrees of freedom. I mean, using the redundancy of the robot, we're able to add to that task a number of new elements where the robot can be expressive. But of course, it's a low priority task compared to the main task. And so it's only feasible if the robot has a kinematic redundancy. And so here, if you look at this video, the robot is waving always the same way. But because we're changing using the kinematic redundancy of the robot, using, for instance, the waist, the head, and the other arm, we're changing the way the robot is actually achieving that task. And it changes completely the perception that you may have of the robot doing a single task. So for instance, here we have one example, and here we have another example where the end waving, theta x dots is exactly the same, but the realization of this task is actually very different. And we showed that using this control method, when participants were asked to interact with the robot, when the robot was in a kind of like sadder, more closed, in like a realization of this task, people were actually standing in the social space, their own social space. They took a certain distance towards the robot. However, when the robot was actually in the happy mode, more open and more cheerful, participants were standing very much closer in a circle in proxemics that is more close to their personal space. So by just changing the way we were realizing the task, we were able to change the way people were actually interacting with the robot and the distance they were able to approach the robot. So by choosing appropriately the way we can interact, we can execute this task in terms of expressivity, we can actually drive more or less unconsciously people towards one type of interaction or the other. And that's quite nice, because if you want people to be careful with the robot, then you probably don't want them to be too close to the robot. But if it's a task where the robot is supposed to help them, then you want to have like a cheerful and welcoming robot so that people actually approach it and can start an interaction with it. And using the same technique, when we were asking participants to move boxes around with the robot, we were able to see that it actually changes their perception of the task, which is an absolutely boring task. And they were able to feel a lot more relaxed when the robot was happy and cheerful, and they were more active, which was also good because then they were more invested into doing this task. But of course, it has some limitations because, as I mentioned, this methodology is only feasible if we have a kinematic redundancy on the robot. So it means that we need to have more degrees of freedom available than those necessary for the task to be achieved. And if we don't have enough degrees of freedom available, then the expressivity basically vanishes into the realization of this task. So to try to balance these limitations that we have in the null-space control, we thought like, okay, maybe we could use optimal control, because what we wanted to think about is like, we want to achieve the task no matter what. We want to be able for the robot to do what it has to do, and we want to be for the robot to be expressive. And because we are, as humans, inherently expressive in our behavior, we thought that optimal control could be a good solution. Optimal control, for those that might don't know, I don't think anyone don't know here in this kind of conference. Optimal control is basically, inverse optimal control is basically thinking that there is an optimality in human motion control, and that was proposed by Flash and Hogan in 1985. And so using work that has been done afterwards on optimal control, we were able to retrieve the inverse optimal cost from human demonstrations using costs that are actually related to expressivity, and in particular, some that are using costs related to Laban notation, so those that are used in dance and in movements evaluation. And then we were able to, using those costs, to generate, using optimal control, movements of our robots, a robot arm that would try to reproduce a similar task. And so it was quite efficient, and we were able, like by showing those movements to participants, we were able to show that basically participants can see that there is something expressive and that it was related to what humans were doing. But again, there's a number of limitations here, is that inverse optimal control and optimal control are absolutely too computationally intensive. And so they're not very handy when you want to do DC in real time, or you want to do adjustments. And also they need to be driven by human demonstrations, and you need to be able to evaluate this expressivity in human demonstrations. The other thing is that, of course, inverse optimal control, the solution that you obtain, is very sensitive to the basis of cost functions that you have chosen. We use the composite 25 cost functions, but those cost functions may not represent the absolute space of all of the cost functions that can represent that movement that you're looking at. And so we have no guarantee, actually, that the set of cost functions that we're using is a full set of cost functions that can represent the movement. And so sometimes when you go back and do the optimal control afterwards, of course, you always find a solution with the inverse optimal control, but you can optimize, but you're not sure that this is actually the movements that you wanted to achieve. So we again proposed a new solution, and we said like, well, since we're still data-driven and we're using human demonstrations, why don't we use human demonstrations in another way and use machine learning-based methods? The first method that we propose is that we don't care anymore about the task. The robot has a task to do, it's okay if the task is not fully achieved, as long as it's almost achieved to some extent. And so by using human demonstrations, we extract using variational autoencoders the features of these expressive movements in human demonstrations. And we also extract some features from the robotic task that we want the robot to achieve. And by using self-attention mechanisms and adding up everything together, we then we are able to decode the movement and to generate a new robot movement that is not the original task exactly. This is the blue line that you have here on the curve. The robot is moving from the start point to another point, but the way the movement is moving is basically using these representative features of the human. And we use the lab inequalities to evaluate the expressivity. And one thing that is absolutely interesting here, and that we were also seeking with optimal control that we couldn't reach perfectly, is that this method is absolutely body independent. So the robot can be here, it's a mobile-based robot that is navigating into the 2D space, but we actually in our paper proved that that works for a robotic arm, and that works for any kind of other embodiments. So you don't have to say that this is the this is mimicking the human. It's just mimicking the style of the human somehow. And this is visible because we're only using the robot kinematic twist in all of our thing and all of our work. And so basically it could be the end effector, it could be the mobile base, and it could be any other part of the robot. And so that's very interesting. Of course, it's not task priority, so we might not achieve fully the task that we want. So if you want your robot to go from A to B, it goes to B around an area, not exactly B, but it is expressive, which in many cases in the interaction that we're actually doing, if the task is not a priority, but the expressivity is one, then this is something that could be very nice to use. And then finally, we were thinking that, well, maybe what we could do also is try to learn from human how to be expressive, but for the robot to investigate its own expressivity. And so we use reinforcement learning-based methods on a small interaction robot that I will present afterwards. And what we're doing is that the robot is trying to match a distribution of moods and behaviors of the human into its own behaviors. And by doing so, we hope to find some kind of synchrony between the human and the robots. And we hope to enhance the interaction between the two and the interest that participants could have in the robot and enjoy the interaction with the robot. So by basically looking at the intention of the humans and at the facial expressions, we basically control our robots to do some movements, and then we also change the lights, like the robot has some lights here. We change also the lights, and then we adapt that to the human behaviors that we're looking at the world, and then we're using a very still yet simple reward function. And then what we found on our experiments over a couple of days is that every time participants were interacting with the robot, this is the intensity of the user experience as perceived by the user, not the measure. What we found is that all of the participants that we asked to interact with the robot for several days in a row found that their intensity and of experience was actually increasing as the robot was learning new behaviors and slowly adjusting towards the same distribution, like mood distribution, as the participants themselves. Of course, all participants have different interaction with the robot, so each of the different participants triggered different behaviors of the robot. So the robot of participant 1, for instance, behaviors are different than the robots of participant 2 and participant 3 after the end of the interactions. The limitation is that, like, in reinforcement learning, what I found very challenging is to choose a meaningful and non-trivial reward function, in particular when it comes to goals and factors that are not necessarily very easily quantitative. In particular, human satisfaction, user experience, positive experience. You don't want to do a reward function that is basically like, we want to maximize the time the human is interacting with the robot. That's absolutely not something that we want to do. We don't want people to get addicted to their robots. But still, you want them to interact more than 2 seconds. So finding this like meaningful reward function is something that we're still working on and that I still find challenging. And in order also to do this kind of interaction, we need to be able to have robots that are designed to get close to the human and longer to the human, and so that the human will actually be attracted to the robot for some time and would like to repeat these kind of interactions, because otherwise we don't have the potential for the robot to learn. If you just go interact once and think like, oh, that's bullshit, I don't want to come again, then this is basically a failure in terms of like human-robot interaction design. And to do so, we proposed to use the concept of slow technology that was originally defined by Holmes and Bachstrom in 2001, where they say that slow technology is a concept that introduces slowness in order to bring an aesthetic dimension, and with the aim of making the technology amplifying the presence of things. And then we decided to think about what our robot could be doing. And of course, we want sometimes our robot to do things for the humans, but not necessarily. What we want to create is a kind of like ecosystem where robots are part of this ecosystem and people enjoy interacting with it, and the robot doesn't necessarily has a function. And for that, we decided to use the concept of behavioral object as described by Grimaud in 2015, where behavioral objects are objects with sometimes unpredictable spontaneous behavior with which we have phases of approach, familiarization, connection, and disconnection, which is quite important. And by doing so, we created Yokobo, which is a small robot that is a robot that you can put in your okay, here. Yeah. So this is a robot that you put in your entrance. And this is a robot that basically greets you when you're at home and you're coming back home. And the robot is here just for cheering you and giving you nonverbal information about what's going on in your house and what's going on inside and outside. So for instance, our robot is connected to a weather station. And so it has access to the information about the humidity outside and inside, the temperature, the weather in general. And we are changing the behavior of the robots and the lights here depending on this information. But of course, you cannot understand what the robot is trying to say and trying to tell to you right now. It's not your vocal assistant where you can ask, what's the weather today? On the other hand, it's a robot that like, by interacting over again and again every day, you see it in your entrance, you are able to learn how your robot is changing its behavior depending on what is going on outside, what is going on inside. And so you can, a little bit like a dog or a cat, which when it's rainy, they don't want to go out. When it's hot, they're basically sleeping and stretching their body. When it's cold, they're like sleeping in a small curly and they cuddle and sleep in the warmth. And so that's very similar to that. But the robot is expressing its own, like it has its own mean of expression. And that is one of the ways of using the concept of slow technology. And we found it interesting as well to change the behavior of the robot, because we want to be able for the robots to be used over a long period of time by humans and by users. And so again, using the reinforcement learning based approach, we are also slightly changing the robot's behavior over time so that participants don't feel the robot is behaving the same for everyone, but it's behaving specifically with them, depending on the kind of interactions that they have with the robot. And our robot is very simple. It's only 3 degrees of freedom. It has one camera here and a proximity sensor. That's it. And then it's connected to the weather station. And what we found that was really interesting, and that goes back to the very beginning of my talk, is that here we were doing a shooting for a television program in Japan, where we put the robot in a Japanese house entrance. And basically, as we were chatting, the robot starts doing its things. And they thought that the robot was actually responding to their voice input. We don't have any microphones on the robot. And they started to imagine that the robot was saying like, no, I don't want to do that. Or what you're saying is stupid. Like, don't tell me that. And that's very interesting because no matter what, even if the robot is just doing something very simple, but it's your very first time interacting with it, you still don't have any clue about what the robot is trying to tell you. And so you're not in the immediate, right now, I want everything to be said and done, but you're on the long-term interaction where you learn what your robot is trying to tell you. And of course, I know what a robot is trying to tell us because I've been interacting with it for a long time. And so I knew that it wasn't responding to voice and it wasn't trying to say anything at that time to them. That was having a connection with the conversation that we had, but using slow technology and using repeated long-term interaction, we can create a system where the human and the robots are basically living in a kind of like symbiosis. And that brings me to the last part of my presentation, where I would like to advocate for robots in the wild and propose an ethology of robots, because there is no intelligence in the lab. Don't get me wrong, not that the students are stupid and we are stupid as researchers. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that doing experiments that are completely scenarized, and that's one of the mainstream of human-robot interaction, is absolutely not a way for us to see any intelligence in our robots, because everything is pre-written. Even participants are basically invited to interact according to a scenario. So if the robot does this, do that. And that's exactly some of the experiments that we were running at some point back at AIST, where, for instance, we were asking participants to come and collect a cup from a robot, but there was no context. There is absolutely no need for them to take this empty cup. What would they actually do that? Like, of course, for us, it's interesting because we wanted to study where people actually hand over a cup to another person, or where they would hand over a cup to a robot, but it's completely decontextualized, and it's absolutely not what is happening when you're actually giving a cup to someone or a robot is actually giving you a cup. And the ethological approach, which you probably are familiar with, and this is an example of Jane Goodall with the chimpanzees, is basically trying to understand animal behaviors in ecological environments. And I would like to propose that we use a similar approach to try to understand how robots are changing our own ways of living and our own ways of thinking about, like, what is humanity, what is it to be a human being, and also how they change our behavior in general. And the ethological approach for robots is really observing what robots and humans are doing in real ecosystems, what they really do, actually. Because as an engineer, you can imagine a number of things that you think people are going to be doing. Actually, they do something very different most of the time when you take the robot out. And so you really need to accept the fact that the robot does not work in a purely causal way from its operating instructions. And the reason why is because it's way too complex. Like, I don't think I got a user manual with my cell phone and I learn on the fly, and there are many things I do and many things I don't do. I use my phone on my own terms. that might be different than somebody else. And that's exactly the same with the new technology that we're having. They're way too complex to come with a user manual. And we are creating very creatively a way to interact with these technologies. And I really like the words of Sungwen Chang, which is an artist that is working with robots, that says that the relationship with robots is no longer that of the user and the instruments, but that of the partners with whom we are living. And that's exactly what I think we are doing now with the new robots. Of course, not the industrial robots that are caged, but the new robots that we're going to see and we're seeing everywhere. And so I'm advocating for robots in the wild where we don't necessarily have scenarios, where participants are free to do whatever they want with the robots. If they want to touch it, if they want to interact with it, or just ignore it, because that's basically what happens, I would say, in 80% or 70% of the cases, is that people absolutely ignore the robots. We once conducted an experiment where we put the robot in the cafeteria at the university. People were just running for food. They didn't care about the robot sitting there and doing things. And most of the time they would just ignore it. And that's exactly what happens. So we need to know that not everyone is attracted to robots, and not everyone has the time and the leisure to get into an interaction with robots. And then when they do, then we have to be sure that we're doing this interaction in the right way. And so robots in the wild, I believe, is the only solution to understand what can happen in the future with the robots. And so I would like to conclude here that for me, intelligence comes with expressive intelligence. It comes with the environmental intelligence as well. We have to understand what is our environment made of and what are the relationship between those elements in the environment. So for instance, when we were using the pleasure arousal dominance model to represent both the human, the robot, both, not both, but the robot, the human, and the environment, we could create a contextual understanding of the situation. And so we could create some kind of emergent intelligence. And I also believe that intelligence is shaped through experience, and we need to create opportunities for these experiences where people are able to meet robots, but also where robots are able to meet people, so that we can build up on these data. And so I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like also to thank all of the people that have been working with us and the people that are supporting our work. You can follow us on internet. And if you are in Tokyo, and I'm sure many of you will be in a couple of weeks, please come and visit us, and you can reach out to me directly by email.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gentiane. It was a wonderful talk. I learned a lot about human-robot interaction, about expressiveness. Yeah, I think quite many people might have questions. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions already in the chat. One question is from Jersey.
Yeah.
He's asking about is there any correlation between kinematic redundancy and the expressiveness of animals? I mean, is it yeah?
So it's a very good question, and I don't have a scientific answer, meaning that I don't know the literature or if there is any study that actually looked at that. But our experience is that even our very rudimentary robot, Yokobo, which has only 3DOF, is already very expressive, and many people are actually understanding or putting expressivity on those behaviors. So I don't think that the number of degrees of freedom and the kinematic redundancy is linked necessarily to more. I think that very simple systems can be very expressive. I hope that answers your question, Jonathan.
Yeah, great. We have one more question from Fumia.
Yeah.
He's asking about the long-term relationship between robot and human. Is there any way to keep robot to keep human less bored and basically keep a longer relationship?
Yeah. So thank you, Ida, for your Ida Sensei, for your question. So long-term relationships for between robots and humans, for me, are relationships that we can build that are week-long, month-long, and year-long relationship. Short-term interactions would be the one that we have. There are encounters, like you go to a station and there's a robot that help you or guide you. And we're still at the level where we're having a short-term relationship, because we only see robots in public spaces where they are here to guide us or to do very petty tasks. And so that's what we have now. And I think we are going to have more long-term interactions. Long-term interactions, we start to have them, for instance, with PARO in elder care institutions. And sometimes in some schools where they have like sometimes robots that are helping children to do their homework or to support education. And of course, there are ways to avoid a human to be bored after a while, and this is a large corpus of the research that I presented today, is trying to adjust behaviors of the robots to humans. So that could be human preferences, that could be other parameters that we can decide. The other thing that is really important is the richness of the interaction. You don't want to have a system that does exactly the same thing every time. And that's what I really don't like with, for instance, with vocal assistants, is that they always respond in the same way and very machine-like, I would say. But for instance, when we plugged in Yokobo into the weather station, and that was actually experiments that we did before we also had Yokobo, we're doing that with a robot arm, is that environmental parameters are changing dynamically, and you don't control them. You don't control the sunlight, you don't control the humidity outside, and you don't control the temperature. And using all of these, like only 3 parameters already, gives you a variety of behaviors that you can use to parameterize your robot behaviors. And I have this amazing memory of one day we were doing a demo to a group of people, and then suddenly our robot behaved very, very awkwardly. It started to do crazy stuff like this, like moving. It was a robot arm and it was trying to do like crazy stuff. I was just like, what's wrong? And then after the demo was over, I went back with my students and everyone. I was just like, so what happened? And we looked at the data, and what happened is that a cloud passed, and suddenly the room was very dark, because we didn't turn on the lights on that day because it was very bright. But then the cloud passed for a couple of seconds, and the robot got like crazy somehow. And then the cloud went away, and the robot retrieved to its normal behaviors. And I think that's a way to create very nice and interactive scenarios. How not to get them addicted. It's a very complex question, because people can get addicted even with very, very simple systems. So I don't have the right answer to that. Maybe it's just like, stop interacting at some point. The robot just like, you know, I'm done. You need to go away, and the interaction stops, and maybe that's good. And that's, I think, something that we're working on, is like not maximizing the interaction time, like you could think could be a good solution, but just getting a kind of like optimal time of interaction that could be a few minutes, and then the robot stops. Yeah. And I see that there are many, many questions.
Yeah, many questions. Yeah, very hot topic. Everyone wants to use the robot. Yeah. Yeah. So how far is it to be integrated in the smart home devices? As you said, like there is like this weather station, or I don't know, like Alexa box or like Siri box. Now it's just a box, right? Not expressive. How far is it to be there?
So Yokobo, our robot that you're seeing here in the video, we have 4 units that we're testing in homes, both in France and in Japan. And so it's working. And so we have it. Not that we're going to build a company that's going to sell it right away, but it's something that can be integrated. Like we can integrate it. It's ready to be integrated in different types of systems. It doesn't have to be our robot as well, because these are software architecture. We can use them with different types of robots. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So we have like quite many questions, but I think like you answered
Yeah.
them. Yeah, you
So
were really answering them, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that like maybe all of these questions for those that are asking them, if you want, you just could take them to Discord and then I would answer right
Yeah,
away. I type them while
that would be great. Yeah, we have also discussion session later on, but
Yeah.
now we'll have a quick break, and then we will be back in 15 minutes for our like panel discussion and the short talks. So yeah, see you then. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.